I don't like the MonsterVerse anymore. I know it's an unpopular opinion, but it's true. I'm no longer a huge fan of the MonsterVerse, and I'm not really that excited for any future movies in the cinematic universe. After seeing Godzilla vs. Kong 4 times on HBO Max, as well as revisiting the other films of this franchise, my opinions have changed a lot over the course of the films. It's such a strange feeling you get that you're the only one who dislikes something that everyone else celebrates as the greatest thing ever. For the record, I don't hate the MonsterVerse. There's plenty of things I really do like. Legendary Warner Brothers has done a good job of hiring filmmakers who are actually fans of the franchise, reinterpreting classic Toho kaiju in a respectful way. I also really dig the world building and mythos surrounding this universe, and giving us the kaiju carnage we come to expect from a big-budget Hollywood blockbuster. Despite all that, it still really feels mediocre, like there's one piece missing that really holds the films back from being truly great. I'm going to dive into my reasons why I don't like the MonsterVerse anymore. This is part 1 of part 2 of my critiques of the MonsterVerse. Please note, these are simply my opinions. I know I've gotten into arguments online recently, especially in YouTube comment sections, about my issues of the MonsterVerse and why I'm concerned for the future of the MonsterVerse. It's important to remember that these are only fictional movies about fictional characters, not vital to our everyday lives. No need to get angry, personal, or vicious over something like this. I wanted to make this 2-part video project to share my frustration with the MonsterVerse and how I think they could have made it better. It can be fun to talk about the good and the bad about these movies, so long as we aren't vicious or personal. With that said, let's get into it. So, with the disclaimer out of the way, it's time to answer the question, why don't I like the MonsterVerse anymore? Looking back at all the 4 films, there are consistent issues across all the films that hold them back from being truly great films. Some minor, some major, some are just personal preferences of mine. From the real problem with the human characters, the uncompelling narratives, to an inconsistent tone and vision. Today I'll be discussing the many issues I have with the MonsterVerse, all of which has informed my current feelings of why I am not as enthusiastic about the MonsterVerse or excited for the future as many others. One of the most common criticisms of the MonsterVerse is the underdeveloped characters. This is nothing new or exclusive to the MonsterVerse, as almost every kaiju movie has been criticized for having uninteresting and boring human characters. Some even go as far to say that the human characters in Godzilla movies don't matter, and only exist to be filler until the kaiju action. I personally disagree with that argument, as the genre has had amazing and memorable human characters, but I'm not going to dive into that, as that'll be a topic for another day. The biggest problems I have with the human characters in the MonsterVerse narrow into 3 reasons. First, the actors behind these roles are no doubt talented, from Bryan Cranston, Samuel L. Jackson, Ken Watanabe, Vera Farmiga, Millie Bobby Brown, to Tom Hiddleston, etc. The cast in these movies have been consistently great. However, their talents are seriously underutilized. Even by Hollywood blockbuster standards, the characters have been rather one-note. Aside from a few standout performances, the actors aren't given the best scripts to work off of. It's their performances that elevate their thinly written roles. Secondly, it doesn't seem like the actors are that enthusiastic of being in a Godzilla or a Kong movie. Sure, they may be familiar with the IPs, but they don't seem like the actors are that enthusiastic of being in a kaiju movie, since they've been in other films that have utilized their acting capabilities far better. While they give good performances, their characters really are one-note and aren't well developed, defined, or have clear goals, weaknesses, strengths, or reasons for us to empathize with. The third and biggest gripe I have with the characters is a reason I don't think anyone has brought up. People complain about how the characters are underdeveloped or are terribly written, but for me, it's the lack of reoccurring characters. By that I mean characters who have been established from the very beginning of the franchise and have always played a role in these movies. We expect them to come back, characters who have been established from the very beginning of the franchise as they grow, change, and develop throughout the films. Think of the original Star Wars trilogy, the Harry Potter films, the Alien and Matrix franchises. Those franchises have a cast of human characters that have been featured since their introductions and have experienced character growth as well as affecting the plot. The MonsterVerse hasn't had a cast of characters that were introduced from the beginning, and any character that had potential is wasted or killed in the only film they appear. The MonsterVerse has introduced many new characters throughout the films, but it would have been nice to have a cast of human characters from the beginning of the MonsterVerse who we get attached to as they change and grow. The human characters in this franchise have consistently been filler, underutilizing the talents of amazing actors, experience no growth or development, and only exist in one film instead of reappearing film to film. I have a number of issues with the stories in the MonsterVerse. The first problem is how familiar they are. If you thought the Marvel Universe has been criticized for having repetitive and formulaic plots, the MonsterVerse is no different. Battling in cities in the 3rd act? Seen it. Human characters being involved but experiencing no character growth and making idiotic decisions? Check. A plethora of movie tropes and cliches seen a million times? Oh yeah. With the conventions of the genre, it makes sense that we want to see kaiju fights take place in cities, with the human characters standing by doing nothing. But if you ask me, You could only do that for so long before it gets fatiguing. Secondly, the lack of stakes. It never really feels like the characters or the world is really in danger when there are giant monsters running around. Sure, in the films, they may say that if we don't do this, the world will end, but let's be honest, you know the characters are going to make it out okay and save the world. It makes for not only predictable and boring storytelling, but no actual stakes, tension, a sense of urgency, and dread. When we see buildings getting destroyed, it should be shocking, as many people have died, but we hardly see anyone inside. The filmmakers don't even give us a chance to care, because it all happens so quickly. So there's a disconnect with what we're seeing and what we're feeling. Compare this to Gojira in 1954, where Godzilla emerges from the sea to attack Tokyo. Sure, he crushes buildings, crushes trains, and sets the city a nuclear ablaze. What really makes this scene haunting and impactful are the crowds of people running away, getting crushed, laying dead, or covered in radiation, or even hugging family members knowing they're gonna die. It's those scenes that make the Tokyo rampage horrifying and believable, especially when it's a symbolic reflection of nuclear destruction, and we care about the people of the city all laid in death and destruction. There's not a single city destruction in the MonsterVerse that comes close to what we saw in Gojira in 1954. We mostly get empty CGI cities that have been evacuated already, with little emotional attachment on the plot and characters. The cities only get wrecked for spectacle's sake. The third and final point I want to make is how unrelatable all of it feels. Because the stories lack stakes, tension, or are too familiar and repetitive, as well as human characters with no real depth or humanity to them, how are you supposed to relate and care about all of this? How are the characters supposed to grow and change when the world around them is crumbling? Going back to Gojira in 1954, the character of Daisuke Zetazawa changes because of the Godzilla attack on Tokyo. He went from an emotionally scarred bystander who didn't want it to be involved in the outside world to becoming a hero by sacrificing his life by using the oxygen destroyer to kill Godzilla, burn all of his research to save the people he cared about, as well as the whole world from both Godzilla and from other nations getting their hands on this weapon. It's that kind of character growth that affects both the characters and the plot, which makes us relate to them even more. Thus, what makes Gojira such an enduring masterpiece. The MonsterVerse simply does not have anything remotely close to that on a plot and character level. To sum up all I've said about my issues with the MonsterVerse on a narrative level, the stories are lacking in originality and complexity. They are filled with too many contrivances, movie cliches done to death, repetitive plot structures that are a million other kaiju movies have done, and lack any stakes or tension, as the kaiju only destroy cities for spectacle's sake, and to set up future films with the exact same outcome. Finally, the stories feel empty on a character level, as no real character development happens, and we never feel for the amount of death and destruction that happens throughout the films. We do get a little bit of that, but not on the same level as Gojira. One of the things I've noticed is how inconsistent the MonsterVerse seems to be in tone, aesthetics, and overall just how every movie feels. There's nothing wrong with films having a different tone, but it's so strange that each MonsterVerse film doesn't really feel like they're in the same universe, and don't seem to stick with the rules, logic, and style established in the first film. We first begin with Godzilla 2014 being the most grounded film, with a dark, serious tone that takes a more realistic approach with the King of the Monsters, as well as emphasizing the true size and weight of the kaiju. They genuinely feel like massive creatures walking on the earth. However, the other films take on a lighter tone, aren't as grounded in realism, and keep retconning a lot of the rules, continuity, and tone established in the previous films. Kong Skull Island, even though it still retained the grounded tone of G14, wasn't dark or serious, but it still treated the concept of Kong and Skull Island in a realistic, grounded way. King of the Monsters and Godzilla vs. Kong is where they really started to move away from the realism tone, with King of the Monsters having hollow earth civilizations, three-headed aliens, giant air fortresses, and somewhat futuristic technology. GVK, on the other hand, had Mechagodzilla, heat vehicles, and underground Earth with inverted gravity, and somehow the kaiju move extremely fast with no real sense of size, weight, despite the fact that they were over 300 feet tall. Now compare this to the Showa era and Heisei era, where sure, they too started out grounded in tone before they introduced aliens, sci-fi tech, and more monsters. But here's the difference between the two. The Showa era and Heisei era took their time to gradually introduce all the science fiction, fantasy stuff you see in later films. The Showa era was the first era of the entire Godzilla franchise, so that transition of Godzilla from dark metaphor of nuclear apocalypse to campy 70s superhero was not only gradual but was necessary for the franchise to grow. Now with the Heisei era, the return of Godzilla, while it was a return to the dark political tone of the original, it still introduced the Super X, an advanced piece of military vehicle, which sets up the rest of the advanced technology seen in the rest of the Heisei era. Don't forget the Showa era lost the tone, the consistent set of rules and logic established. The Heisei era managed to stick to a set of rules and consistent tone established in the first film, even as the era introduced time travel, mutations, mecha, etc. Going back to the MonsterVerse, it feels rushed. They constantly change the tone, vision, and even discard some continuity. And the MonsterVerse even discards the sets of rules established in Godzilla 2014, as that film didn't establish a cinematic universe or a rematch with King Kong. Not that the MonsterVerse doesn't have a consistency or things that line up on a storytelling level,
But if you ask me, I feel like the MonsterVerse should have had one director behind each film to add a level of consistency, as well as a singular vision. Compare this to other franchises like the Marvel Universe or the Harry Potter films, where sure, they have different writers and directors behind some of the films, but they still manage to consistently stick to the set of rules established with the first film. Despite being different, they still felt like they were part of the same universe. You can even look at movie trilogies such as the Indiana Jones films, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight trilogy. They all have the same group of writers, directors behind each of the films to give the trilogies consistency as well as sticking to a specific tone. I do feel like the MonsterVerse should have done just that, have one filmmaker behind each of the films to give it consistency. You can still add aliens, high tech, without destroying the rules established in the first film. What I'm trying to get at here is that the MonsterVerse movies don't have a specific tone to give the universe consistency. Sure, the films do share consistencies on a storytelling level and thematic level, but they don't 100% feel like they're part of the same universe, when there are continuity, stylistic, tone, lore, and visual differences between all the films.
The MonsterVerse has done something very interesting, letting 4 relatively unknown filmmakers take the helm of the 2 biggest giant monster movie franchises of all time. Gareth Edwards and Jordan Vogt Roberts are 2 filmmakers from an indie background. They've directed only 1 film before taking on a big-budget kaiju movie. First of all, Edwards has done Monsters, Godzilla, and Rogue One. I've seen Rogue One, the best Disney Star Wars movie, and Monsters, which I really enjoyed. It was a unique and atmospheric take on both the monster and alien genre. I have yet to see Kings of Summer. It's quite admirable and inspiring to see 2 indie filmmakers tackle on a big-budget blockbuster film. But if you ask me, that's quite a leap for these inexperienced filmmakers to helm big-budget franchises when they are just discovering their inner potential. Michael Dougherty and Adam Wingard are the 2 filmmakers from both indie backgrounds and having helmed big studio films, but they've never done a huge blockbuster on the scale of King of the Monsters or Godzilla vs. Kong. Dougherty has written and directed Trick or Treat and Krampus, 2 low-budget holiday horror films. I've seen Krampus, which was a pretty good Christmas horror flick, with some great visuals, great atmosphere, but really corny and bad writing. You have to see an Adam Wingard film before Godzilla vs. Kong, so I can't really comment on him. Wingard, I would say, is the most experienced MonsterVerse director, as he's done a number of other films before GVK. What I'm trying to say here is that the 4 current directors don't really seem fit to direct or write a big-budget blockbuster, especially when they have very small resumes, or have had a mediocre track record, or even just a cult following. It shows by the lighting, the cinematography, the editing, and directorial choices, which sometimes feel amateurish when you watch these films. Given Hollywood's current trend of letting an indie director take on a big-budget franchise film, only for the studio to squander their capabilities, or they themselves aren't fitted enough to handle a movie of that scale, it seems to be the case here. I respect and admire the styles of each filmmaker of the MonsterVerse, as they put their unique stamps on both the Godzilla and Kong franchises. However, it doesn't seem like they're fit enough to write or direct big-budget films when their resumes are not very big or haven't been that great. Don't you think it would make more sense for studios to hire directors who have actually helmed big-budget blockbusters to do a Godzilla film? Directors like J.J. Abrams, Guillermo del Toro, Steven Spielberg, James Wan, Peter Jackson, or even Tim Burton. I feel like these are the kind of directors who can do a big-budget kaiju or Godzilla movie, since they've had experience with studio films and blockbusters. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to knock the 4 MonsterVerse directors. It's just that they don't seem experienced or talented enough to helm big-budget spectacles. A lot of people like to say that the MonsterVerse is supposedly great because it respects the Toho films, that they are faithful to the classic Godzilla movies. While I understand that mindset, I do disagree with what a lot of people have to say. Just because a movie is faithful or respects the source material doesn't mean it is good. Adding fan service, callbacks, Easter eggs to the Toho films as well as replicating the tone of said films doesn't add to the quality of a movie, as those films are not connected on a narrative and continuity level. Thus, touching upon them does nothing for the film's quality. I should stress that there's nothing wrong with films being faithful to the source material. You can still stay true to the spirit and traditions of the original work, so long as your work stands on its own. Godzilla 2014 managed to look, feel, and be a Godzilla movie without resorting to fan service or copying and pasting the Toho films. It was original in its own right while still honoring the spirit of the Toho Godzilla. Even Kong Skull Island looked, felt, and was a Kong movie that subverted a lot of the usual tropes you expect in a Kong film. But then you get to Godzilla King of the Monsters and Godzilla vs. Kong, where they leaned heavily towards the Toho tradition, with cheesy dialogue, over-the-top set pieces, cramming a lot of action scenes, subplots, tons of Easter eggs, nods, homages, and reverence to the point where it becomes overwhelming. Both films, you can say, were overindulgent, relying too much on recreating classic scenes and imitating the tone of the Showa-era Godzilla films, instead of being original and sticking with the tone of how Godzilla 2014 looked and felt, like a Godzilla movie without relying on nostalgia or fan service. That isn't to say the MonsterVerse doesn't have any new ideas or a tone of its own. It has established some very interesting lore and world building, like the Hollow Earth, Titanology, the ancient connection man had with the Titans. The MonsterVerse does, however, lean more on the Toho tradition and tone, such as the kaiju fights, the epic moments, and colorful visuals,
but I wish the MonsterVerse took more risk, or more original, delved deeper into the characters, the plot, and the themes, and stuck to a specific tone and look that manages to feel like Godzilla without aping the classic Godzilla movies too much. I also want to ask the question, don't you think it's redundant for Legendary and Warner Brothers to lean heavily on the tone and tradition of the Toho Godzilla movies when most of them aren't very good and haven't aged well, as well as containing the same things we've seen millions of times already, just done on a bigger budget? You can only lean so far into tradition before it goes too far and becomes a parody of itself. Generally speaking, I don't have that many issues with the kaiju or titans themselves. After all, the kaiju are the main reason we see these kind of films. Godzilla and Kong are easily the best characters on the MonsterVerse, as they are given very different personalities, great designs that strike a balance of being traditional and unique in their own right. They've done a good job of keeping the spirit of Godzilla, Kong, Mothra, Rodan, Ghidorah, and Mechagodzilla, while still being refreshing interpretations for American audiences. However, my issues don't stem from their designs or portrayals. It's how they've been utilized that has me a bit conflicted. Godzilla in the 2014 film did feel like a secondary character in his own movie, while the Mutos were the focus for 2/3 of it. Kong in Skull Island isn't given much growth or characterization, outside of what he does, even though he was technically the main star of that film. Rodan, Mothra, and Ghidorah were generally well designed, had distinct personalities, and great care went into differentiating them, and I respect that. However, all three did feel criminally underused, and didn't really live up to their full potential. While all three do get some great moments, Rodan and Mothra both barely did that much, and felt like last-minute additions, whereas Ghidorah failed as an antagonist and the arch-nemesis of Godzilla. He's meant to be this imposing extraterrestrial titan that spells doom for all life on Earth, but he never truly felt like a threat to either Godzilla or the world. He relies heavily on regeneration, beam spamming, and even flight to stand a chance against Godzilla. And even then, Godzilla constantly owned him in every single battle. Then we get to Mechagodzilla, which in my opinion has the best design out of the Toho characters next to Godzilla himself. He has a really cool design, abilities, a menacing personality, and has very creative tie-in with Ghidorah, but he was barely in the film, appearing only in the final battle, with little build-up or thematic layers to justify why he's in the MonsterVerse, outside of just being a final boss for Godzilla and Kong to team up against. It felt like they were obligated to include Mechagodzilla for the sake of completing the roster of the Big Five, instead of being a natural and logical addition to the MonsterVerse. It's a real shame that this is the first time Rodan, Mothra, Ghidorah, and Mechagodzilla were portrayed in a big-budget American Godzilla series, only for them to be underused and wasted potential. The new kaiju such as the Mutos, the Skullcrawlers, and the Flora Fauna, I thought were extremely well designed, portrayed, and tied to the plot of both Godzilla 2014 and Kong Skull Island pretty well. The Titans of King of the Monsters and Godzilla vs. Kong, however, were just cannon fodder and only existed to expand the lore. You can cut them out of the films, and it won't change anything. Lastly, I'm confused with the ancient rivalry thing going on with Godzilla and the other Titans he has faced. The Kaiju Network made an excellent video on how there's a possible plot hole and inconsistencies with the supposedly unique rivalries Godzilla's had with each Titan when they play out the same as before with the same outcomes. It shows that even the best thing of the MonsterVerse, the monsters themselves, is not perfect. Some of it is just my personal opinion, and some of it is actual criticism. With all the issues laid out, hopefully something in here made you see the MonsterVerse in a different way, even if you disagree with me, which I'm okay with. I hope you at least understand why I don't like the MonsterVerse anymore. As monster movies that are made to be big-budget homages to the classic Showa-era films, they can be fun and entertaining. However, I honestly believe we deserve better from an American Godzilla film. It's very unfortunate that so many fans celebrate the MonsterVerse like it's the greatest thing in cinema history, when these films have been mediocre at best. While I can understand where fans are coming from as they get to express their gleeful joy of seeing their favorite movie monster brought to life on the big screen, that doesn't excuse why the films have to be corporate pieces of entertainment that show little effort on a filmmaking and storytelling level. These are the kind of fans I hope they never write or direct a movie, those who say that Godzilla movies only need kaiju fights and nothing more. They obviously know nothing about what makes a movie in terms of actual storytelling and filmmaking. A Godzilla movie with tons of fan service, faithfulness to the Toho films, and with action scenes after action scenes at the expense of great filmmaking, great storytelling, and great characters is not what makes a good movie. I'm honestly sick of people in the fandom over-glorifying King of the Monsters in the fandom as a whole, when there are actual criticisms about them. And just because Toho has given us mediocre to bad films doesn't excuse why these American films have to be exactly like the Toho films, which, if we're going to be honest, most of them haven't aged well and are pretty bad. I still like and respect them, but they are not good on a filmmaking storytelling level. Legendary Warner Brothers literally had the chance to give us a handful of amazing Godzilla films that both fans, non-fans, and even critics could enjoy. But instead they had to pander to fanboys who care more about Godzilla, as well as YouTubers who feed into that and believe everything about the MonsterVerse is perfect when they are straight up lying to you.
According to most fans, we deserve mediocre American Godzilla films that are just a lazy copy and paste imitation of the Toho films done with a $200 million budget. Apparently, we don't need Godzilla films on par with Gojira, Jurassic Park, The Dark Knight, The Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Return of Godzilla, Jaws, or even Alien. No one in the fandom or general audiences wants a good story, real and compelling characters anymore. Just as long as they get the only thing they care about, endless kaiju action. It saddens me that I'm part of a fandom who's okay with this mindset and brush off actual criticisms that can't help the filmmakers and studios to learn from their mistakes. I may have ranted there, and I may sound harsh, and while I have talked bad to people and assumed bad things about them, but that's because I genuinely care. I care about Godzilla, I care about the franchise, I truly believe we deserve more. I still hope we get that amazing Godzilla movie that, while it doesn't need to be high art or have 20 Shakespearean level of complex characters, it still manages to be both entertaining and extremely well made as a movie. This leads me to my next point regarding the future of the MonsterVerse. Hashtag Continue the MonsterVerse has trended a lot on Twitter, all over social media, so fans want the MonsterVerse to continue so they can get more Titan carnage. Even Legendary has noticed and has commented about it on their Twitter page. A large amount of fans really want to see more of this universe, but what do I think? I honestly wouldn't mind if the MonsterVerse does actually continue and we get more films. And I have my own reasons why I don't want the MonsterVerse to continue, and reasons why I don't want it to continue. On the one hand, the Godzilla adore community really wants to see more of the mythos, the Hollow Earth, and all the things they've established in the MonsterVerse with the books, the tie-in novels, the films, and an anime coming up about Skull Island to flesh it out more. Introduces more of the new Titans, especially the ones we didn't see in King of the Monsters, and maybe bring some Toho Kaiju such as Biollante, Anguirus, Gigan, Titanosaurus, Baragon, and maybe even Destroya. There's a slight chance that Gareth Edwards can come back to direct at least one more film to bring back the realism tone of G14. Even though the universe has evolved to have a lot of crazy stuff in it, you can still tell a story in this universe with that tone, like how Captain America the Winter Soldier and Civil War had the more grounded, serious tone in the MCU, despite all the aliens, wizards, comic book stuff around it. But on the other hand, I do have my own reasons for why the MonsterVerse should not continue. People are going to overhype each film like it's going to be the next greatest thing, when months after the film comes out, people are going to be extremely divided over it and start fights over it. It's a pattern that's been a thing since G14, and every movie in the MonsterVerse so far has been pretty divisive. Godzilla vs. Kong will become divisive in time, just watch. There is such a thing as you can't have too much of a good thing. Assuming we do get other Toho Kaiju and new Titans, which sounds awesome as a Godzilla fan, it would no doubt be difficult to write and direct a movie of that scale, since you're going to have to cram a lot of stuff in there and make a potentially 3 to 4 hour long movie with an insanely high budget. I'm personally fine with the MonsterVerse having only a handful of Toho Kaiju while the rest are original. If the MonsterVerse does continue, you know deep down, most of these films will be pretty bad, delivering on the Kaiju actions, catering only to the hardcore fans, and forgetting about everything else. I don't want mediocre to bad Kaiju movies, and I don't want there to be so many movies in this universe that it'll get fatiguing. Overstuffed with the same plot, character arcs, and the same outcomes. Quantity isn't the same as quality. Finally, I'm personally done with cinematic universes. You remember when films stood on their own? Remember when we had amazing films with great stories, compelling characters, and excellent filmmaking? The most we got was a trilogy or a handful of movies. I wish more people can acknowledge that and demand better from the studios. Don't make every movie either an interconnected universe or a team-up versus movie, a lazy nostalgia-fueled love letter to the old movies, or even just big dumb popcorn flicks. The MonsterVerse could have been great, but instead it ticked all of those boxes of what's hurting the film industry. After all of that rambling, it may sound like I hate the MonsterVerse, that I don't think America deserves to do another Godzilla movie ever again after the MonsterVerse is over. The truth is, I wanted to make this two-part critique video to express my frustrations, my criticisms, and concerns for the MonsterVerse. I went over why the films are lacking on a narrative, character, universe consistency, and filmmaking level. I expressed my issues I have with the fanbase who seem to be okay with accepting mediocre films that are just slightly better versions of the Toho films, done on a high budget, and why that shouldn't be an excuse for why films should be bad. I of course went over why I'm okay with the MonsterVerse continuing, and why I don't think it should continue. I believe as a fanbase we deserve better films, with originality, compelling stories, and amazing characters, mixed with incredible kaiju action. Imagine getting a Godzilla movie made today with a stellar script, excellent filmmaking, storytelling, and characters that's on par with films like the original Gojira, The Return of Godzilla, GMK, Jurassic Park, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Dark Knight trilogy, instead of just getting love letters after love letters of the Toho films when 2/3 of the actual Toho-produced Godzilla movies are not good. I find it unfortunate that people in the fanbase don't ask for something like that and instead want the same crap over and over again. With all that said, I respect the MonsterVerse. I have enjoyed almost all the films in this universe. It was still a good journey seeing Godzilla adapted into American cinema the correct way. following the disastrous 1998 World Limerick Godzilla. There are a lot of things I liked about the MonsterVerse, but I still get a sense of disappointment and desire for these films to be better. Ultimately though, I'm still thankful for this 7-year-long cinematic journey that pitted Godzilla and Kong, the two greatest movie monsters of all time, into a rematch that we never thought would happen. The MonsterVerse may not be great cinema or the very films we imagine, it still succeeded where most other cinematic universes failed. In a time where society is obsessed with making cinematic universes to rival Marvel without understanding what made it work in the first place, the MonsterVerse, in my opinion, is a perfect encapsulation of the best and the worst of a cinematic universe. This concludes part 1 of 2 of my critiques of the MonsterVerse. Stay tuned for part 2 where I discuss how I would fix the MonsterVerse. Hopefully you made it this far into the video. This video is already very long, it took me over 10 days to make. Hopefully you understood all the points I've made about my frustrations with the MonsterVerse, how certain fans hold it on a pedestal that it doesn't deserve to be, as well as my hopes and concerns for the future of the franchise. If you agree or disagree, that's perfectly fine. At the end of the day, we should all be thankful that a cinematic universe pitting Godzilla and Kong, produced by an American studio, actually happened, offering the best and the worst of Hollywood's current obsessions with cinematic universes. But what do you think? Do you think the MonsterVerse is underrated or overrated? Would you want the MonsterVerse to continue or end with Godzilla vs. Kong? What is your favorite film of the MonsterVerse? Let me know in the comment sections down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe to my channel, and share this video to help my channel grow. And as always, long live the kings.